Welcome, my name is Joel, and in this video I'm going to tell you about something that you probably have not been told about before if you have watched videos or read articles on minimalist miking techniques for drums. 1, 2, 3, 4 mics. I think it's become a really popular topic of conversation and a really popular approach for recording these days, and you see lots of videos and articles dedicated to that because I assume, I don't know, but I assume, because most people who have a desire to record now have the ability to record, 4 channels of audio simultaneously. An interface capable of that, a little USB interface, is not expensive, a few $100 maybe, and a few $100 for 4 decent, appropriate microphones for tracking drums. It's really not a big expense, and so people are very interested, I think, in doing that, and that has made that a more popular topic of conversation than it was, say, 10 years ago. And I would say that the most talked about approach to it would be one that was developed by Glen Johns, the famous British producer and engineer. Worked with a huge portion of the Rolling Stones catalog. He worked with Led Zeppelin, The Who, The Beatles, first couple of Eagles records. He had a really prolific career. And during most of that, he used what people refer to as the Glen Johns technique, which is 3 microphones, one on the kick and then a pair of large diaphragm condensers over the drum kit, one positioned directly over the drum kit facing down at the snare drum, or maybe where the snare drum kind of meets the rack tom. Most of these kits at the time in the 60s were 4-piece kits. And then the other large diaphragm mic kind of the outside of the floor tom looking across to the snare drum, and the mics were generally equidistant from the middle of the snare drum so that together they reinforced the snare, allowed for some interest in the spectrum if you were to pan them opposite each other, and better represented the floor tom tonality and just got a better overall image of the kit. And so it was a really desirable thing. And while we think of it today as a minimalist approach, the truth is when he developed it in the 60s, it was probably considered pretty extravagant by his contemporaries, because instead of using one mic, which really was the standard through most of that decade, over the top, he used 2. I'm sure there were people who thought that was ridiculous. But I'm going to show you something in this video that is not talked about ever, save for one video that I have ever seen where it is discussed somewhat. It's not discussed exhaustively. And the reason why it is what it is and it works the way it does is not discussed at all, so I'm going to do that here. Again, I'm not going to talk too much about the techniques themselves, but I will do a quick rundown to explain to you the technique that I use to capture the audio for this video. And that is, I used an AKG D112 in the bass drum. The bass drum's a 24 by 14-inch Ludwig, just inside the hole, kind of pointing to the back corner, if you will, of the drum, not directly at the beater, but kind of getting the overall perspective of the interior of the drum. And then I had a mic on the snare drum, a Heil PR31, which is one that I will often use on the snare drum. And then the overheads that I used, or rather the kit mics, I guess would be more accurate, is a pair of cheap Chinese condensers that I modified. If you are into DIY electronics, modifying microphones and things like that, you can find lots of videos on modifying cheap Asian condenser microphones. It's the classic Sheps circuit that most all the mics coming out of China are using. And you can replace 3 capacitors in it, 3 ceramic caps, 1 with a polystyrene and 2 with film caps. And that improves the quality of the circuit sonically pretty significantly. And then on top of that, I actually added better capsules. But I literally have maybe just over $200 in that pair of microphones. And that's what I used, because I'm not trying to use anything particularly extravagant. And furthermore, I used my Midas console preamps. I didn't use the Neves or my Rascal Audios or APIs or any of the other stuff that I have. I just used the Midas preamps. So I want to show you that you can get good results with modest gear. The one change that I did to Glen Johns' technique, he typically puts a mic directly overhead facing straight down at the snare drum. I did not do that. I pushed it out a little bit closer to sort of the outer rim of the rack tom, aiming at the snare drum. So it's kind of at an angle. And the reason I did that is so its angle relative to the rack tom was similar angle and spacing, similar to the angle and spacing of the side mic to the floor tom, because having it directly overhead kind of gave a slightly different perspective of that tom. When I moved it into a similar position, they sounded like they matched a little bit more. So I just used my ears and just made a judgment call on that. But here's what you need to know about what I'm going to refer to as distance miking. You've got to tune the drums up if you want the timbre, the overall tonality, the body, and the sustain of the toms to come through. You've got to tune them up. I'm talking about tuning them to their mid-range. Mid-range is generally higher than you would normally tune. If you tuned a 12-inch tom to its mid-range, and that was your main rack tom, it probably would be a higher pitch than you're used to, probably a higher pitch than you really want. Same with the floor tom if you tune them to their mid-range. So what I did for this video is I did 2 takes, one with 12 and 16-inch floor tom, tuned the way I would normally tune them if I was going to close mic them. Because I think that's what most people do when they try a minimalist miking technique. They don't change the tuning of the drums. So if they're tuning them fat, and low, maybe they're using double ply heads, maybe you got moon gels and things on there making them really kind of dull. That works okay if you're miking them up close, but when you back off a few feet, it's going to come across as slap and mud, and you're not going to get much sustain or anything that you really want from them. So to demonstrate that, 12 and 16-inch toms tuned the way I would normally tune them. Then, for comparison, I basically played the same groove, all the same miking techniques and the same mixing. Everything that I did identically to both. But the second one has a 14-inch rack tom and an 18-inch floor tom. So each of them are 2 inches larger, but I tuned them to the same pitches. I used the tune bot and tuned them to the same pitches that I used for the 12 and the 16. So the 12 and the 16 were the pitches that I want to hear from the toms. But then I used larger diameters and tuned them to the same pitches, which means they're tighter, which means they're more like in the mid-range. And they're much brighter. When you play them sitting in the room, you'll see they're a lot brighter. And I didn't use any muffling. I think on the 18-inch floor tom, I did use one little piece of gaff tape with a single accordion fold just to tame a little bit of the overbearing, because it's an 18-inch drum tuned to its mid-range, so it's kind of live. First is the 12 and 16. That's what I would call the typical arrangement for people trying to do minimalist miking. They just don't really tune the drums differently, but they put the mics farther away. And then the second is with the 14 and the 18. Everything else the same, and the same pitches from the drums. Listen for the attack, listen for the overall tonality or the timbre of the drum, and listen for the sustain from the toms specifically. Listen to the difference. Pretty interesting stuff, isn't it? Now, I'm going to show you those same clips again, arranged a little differently. It'll be the 12 and 16 for a few bars, and then the 14 and the 18, then the 12 and the 16, and the 14 and the 18. I'm going to go back and forth kind of nonstop. And I'm just telling you straight up front so that you don't get too confused by it. But you are going to swear. I'm just telling you right now, you're going to swear that one of them is quieter than the other, that I actually wasn't playing as hard, or that I actually mixed it differently, or something was inconsistent about, those two performances and the way that they were mixed and engineered. There is nothing different about them. One could argue that maybe I did play a little differently, except that when I turned the overheads off and just listened to the kick and snare, they were the same. I mean, they were the same. So like I was playing the same. So when you put the overheads back in, the whole image changes. Indeed, listen also for the difference in the sound of the snare drum, which is weird. And this I actually didn't really expect, even though I've done this before. But just doing the actual comparison, I was a little shocked at the difference in the perception of the snare drum. So check that out, and I'll come back and kind of explain to you my thoughts about that too. Okay, so you see what I mean? One of them, you swear, Joel, the 12 and the 16 are much quieter. It's much quieter. You screwed up somehow. This isn't a good comparison. No, it's a fantastic and relevant comparison. It absolutely shows what I'm trying to show you about the need for using larger diameters tuned up to the pitches that you want. Either that or you can use smaller diameters and just tune them up above what you would normally want. But if you have pitches, you need to find drums that will reach those pitches when tuned to their mid-range. And then minimal miking really, really works. Now, regarding the snare drum, what I think is happening is, you know, when I'm sitting in the room playing the drums are reacting to the snare drum. Drums do that, right? You're playing drums and your toms sort of sit there and resonate. Well, when they're tuned up to their mid-range, that resonance or that sympathetic response is louder, and it's being excited by the frequencies of the snare drum. So those frequencies are it's almost like the toms are acting in a way like a resonance chamber or like a reverb chamber, but it's not so much adding length, it's just adding more tonality from the overhead mics. So, you know, when I'm sitting there playing the toms and doing that little back and forth groove, there is constant body, there's constant resonance and sustain and constant sort of low frequency sound. That's all just those big toms reacting not only to being played, but also to the snare drum being played and probably the kick drum being played. And it's just adding more what I would consider glue, really. It's kind of filling in all that stuff. Now, as far as the processing, I'm not going to go into big, long detail, but one thing that I will say is worth noting that I rarely see mentioned in a video, but occasionally I do, and that is Glen Johns' propensity with vintage consoles to turn the mic preamp up with additional gain. He says, I turn up the gain, 10 dB, and then I compensate 10 dB down on the fader. And the reason you do that, he is talking an old vintage console. He's not talking like a modern digital console. He's talking like a Neve or, an API or a Trident A-Range or something like that. Transformer balance, the gorgeous, colorful transformer that's going to saturate with transients, like from drums, and then either vacuum tube or adolescent transistor technology that's really slow, sluggish, also is going to round off transients and will generate second or third order harmonics, which makes the sound more interesting to listen to. And so all I really did in the mix, other than EQing, I just used the tape simulator, a Waves Kramer tape simulator was the one that I used, and just pushed it about 6 dB, and it's set so that the output automatically compensates unless you unlink them. So I just pushed a little bit with that, and it compensated on the output and just gave it a bit more of a richer, more interesting image. Beyond that, I didn't compress, I didn't do anything particularly unique to it. It's really just the sound of the drums, EQ'd, And then the overall mix, I will say I did add my typical compression to the overall mix. Pretty slammed the Abbey Road compressor that Waves makes. I forget which one it is, what they call it, but I like it on drums. I slam it really hard, and then I use parallel mode to mix about maybe 30 or 40% of that in with the dry signal. So it's definitely adding some character. Really, it's adding some snap and making it really lively and making those toms that are farther away from the mics to feel a bit closer and feel bigger. So you can get big rock sounds from minimal miking techniques. but it's really good if you can use some larger diameters. Tune those drums up to their mid-range, and you will get more of the sound you expect to get from them from the mics that are several feet away rather than directly on the drums. And that's basically all I got for you. So thank you for watching this. I really hope that it is useful to you, that it's giving you kind of a new perspective or some new tricks, something that you want to go try out. Do that. Enjoy that. Please subscribe. Please like. Please share with anyone you think would be like-minded. Drums, drums, drums. That's what this channel is about. All kinds of drums. Recording, building, playing, history, all that. Thanks for watching this video. I really do appreciate it. Thanks.